Shrek the Third is the exact moment DreamWorks got scared. Okay, so nobody's going to fight me on this one, but let's talk about it anyway, because I don't think people actually understand why Shrek the Third is bad. Everyone agrees it's the weak one. Forgettable songs, jokes that don't land, a plot that kind of just happens to people instead of coming from anybody. That part isn't controversial. What I don't think people have actually sat with is why it happened right there, on the third film, after two movies that took real swings and landed almost every single one of them. Because Shrek the Third isn't just a worse movie. It's the exact moment you can watch DreamWorks get scared. Here's the thing about the first two films that's easy to lose. Once a franchise becomes a franchise, they weren't trying to protect anything. The first one had nothing to lose because nobody had any idea it was going to work. The second one still had that same energy, mostly because nobody at the studio fully understood yet what Shrek even was as a cultural object. Whether it was a one-off hit or a fluke, nobody really knew, so they just kept making the thing that felt true and hoped it worked again. It worked again. It worked enormously. Shrek 2 became one of the highest grossing animated films ever made at that point. And that's exactly where the problem starts, because the moment a movie makes that much money, the conversation around the next one stops being, what do we want to say? And starts being, what do we need to protect? You can feel the fear in almost every choice Shrek the Third makes if you're looking for it. Start with the actual plot. Shrek finds out he's going to be king, and spends the entire movie trying to get out of it so he can go back to his old life. That's not nothing as a premise. There's actually a decent idea buried in there about responsibility and identity. But watch how the film handles it. It never really commits to making Shrek sit in the discomfort of that choice the way the first two films would have. It resolves the tension almost immediately by finding a replacement king, Artie, who conveniently wants the job and doesn't need any further examination. Problem solved. Nobody has to be uncomfortable for very long. The movie can get back to jokes. Compare that to how the first film handled Shrek's central conflict. It didn't let him off easy. It made him sit inside being unlovable for the entire runtime, before giving him anything close to relief. And even then, the relief came with real cost attached. He had to actually change, actually risk being seen. Shrek the Third doesn't ask Shrek to risk anything close to that. It hands him an exit ramp almost as soon as the problem shows up. That's not bad writing exactly. That's writing that's scared of sitting in discomfort for too long, because discomfort is the thing that tests well badly in a screening room when there's $100 million riding on the opening weekend. Then there's the humor. And this is where I think the fear shows up the most clearly. The first two films had jokes that took a real swing. The torture interrogation of the gingerbread man, the entire Duloc sequence mocking Disney's whole aesthetic without blinking, the dinner scene chaos in Shrek 2 that's genuinely uncomfortable to sit through in the best way. These are jokes that risk landing badly because they're actually going for something. Shrek the Third's humor mostly goes for the safe, recognizable beat. Puss in Boots getting stuck in a fat suit. A high school dance sequence dropped in because high school movies were having a moment. References that exist because referencing things was working for the franchise already, not because the joke itself needed to be there. It's the difference between a joke that's trying to say something true about a character and a joke that's trying to remind you of a joke that worked before. You can practically hear the meeting where somebody says, the audience loved the pop culture stuff. In the second one, let's do more of that. And nobody in the room asks whether more of that actually serves anything this time. And look, I get why this happens. I'm not pretending I'd have made different choices sitting in that boardroom with that much money on the line. When something works as enormously as Shrek 2 worked, the rational move is to protect what worked. Nobody gets fired for doing more of the thing that already made everyone rich. People get fired for taking a swing that misses. But that's exactly the problem. The thing that made the first two films actually mean something wasn't the swamp, or the donkey jokes, or the pop songs. It was the willingness to risk a swing that misses, because the truth underneath the joke mattered more than the safety of the joke landing. Shrek the Third is the first time you can watch that willingness disappear in real time, replaced by a much safer instinct. Give the audience what already worked, don't ask anyone to sit in anything uncomfortable for too long, protect the asset. That instinct isn't unique to DreamWorks, and it's not really about this one franchise. It happens to basically every creative thing that becomes successful enough to be worth protecting. The first attempt at something is usually made by people who have nothing to lose, which is exactly why it's often the most honest thing they'll ever make. Every attempt after that gets made by people who now have something real on the line, and that changes the math on every single choice, whether anyone in the room admits it out loud or not. Shrek the Third didn't fail because DreamWorks lost talent or stopped caring about the franchise. It failed because the fear got into the room, and fear makes a worse collaborator than almost anything else in a creative process. It doesn't make you write worse jokes on purpose. It makes you flinch right before the joke that would have actually meant something, and reach for the safer one instead. That's the real story behind why Shrek the Third doesn't work. And honestly, once you see it there, you start noticing it everywhere else too. Not just in this franchise. In basically every sequel made by a studio that's finally figured out exactly how much money is riding on getting it right. And look at where that leaves the franchise now. Shrek the Third didn't kill anything. The franchise kept going. Shrek 4 happened. The brand kept making money. But the version of DreamWorks willing to risk a swing that misses never really came back in the same way. Once a studio learns it can protect the asset and still get paid, that becomes the new default setting. Not a one-time decision, but a habit. You can see the habit calcify even further by the fourth film, Shrek Forever. After tries to recapture some of the original edge by imagining a version of the world where Shrek never existed, which is honestly a clever premise on paper. But even that premise gets handled with kid gloves compared to how the first two films would have run with it. The darker version of Far Far Away, under Rumpelstiltskin's rule, gets sanitized into something that's spooky in a Halloween costume way, rather than genuinely unsettling. The film knows exactly how far it's allowed to go and stays well inside that line the entire time. That's not a creative failure of imagination. That's a studio that's fully internalized the lesson Shrek the Third taught everyone 3 years earlier, which is probably part of why that new trailer everyone's been arguing about felt the way it felt to so many people. It's not really because anybody currently working on Shrek 5 doesn't care about the franchise. It's more so the fear that showed up for the first time back in 2007 never really left the building. It just got quieter, more built in. The kind of caution that doesn't need a meeting anymore, because everyone already knows the answer before the question gets asked. I don't think that's necessarily DreamWorks' fault in some evil corporate sense, and I'm not trying to paint anyone there as villains in this story. I think it's just what happens to anything that becomes worth protecting. The scary part isn't that a studio got cautious. The scary part is how invisible caution becomes once it's had almost 20 years to settle in. You stop noticing it's there. You just notice the films feel different, and you can't quite say why. Shrek the Third is the moment you can actually point to and say there, that's when it started. Everything after that is just the same fear, getting more comfortable in the room. And here's the part I think is actually worth sitting with after all of this, because it's bigger than one franchise. Every single thing you've ever loved that became big enough to matter financially is going through some version of this right now, or already went through it, whether you noticed or not. The band whose later albums feel safer, the show that got more cautious once it became a hit, the franchise that stopped surprising you somewhere around the third or fourth entry. It's not a coincidence that it happens at roughly the same point almost every time. That's usually exactly when the people making the thing first fully understand what they have to lose. So when you watch the Shrek 5 trailer and something about it feels off in a way you can't quite name, you're probably not actually upset about the trailer. You're noticing the fear. The same fear that's been quietly running this franchise since 2007, just a little more confident now that nobody's calling it out by name. So when you watch the Shrek 5 trailer and something about it feels off in a way you can't quite name, you're probably not actually upset about the trailer itself. You're noticing the fear. The same fear that's been quietly running this franchise since 2007, just a little more confident now that nobody's calling it out by name. Maybe calling it out by name is worth doing more often. Not as a way of punishing a studio for being cautious, because honestly, caution is a completely understandable response to having something worth losing. But because the only way anything gets its nerve back is if enough people notice it's gone and say so clearly enough that it becomes impossible to ignore. Shrek the Third is where it started. Whether it ends anywhere different depends entirely on whether the people making the next 10 years of this franchise are willing to risk a swing that misses again. That's a harder thing to ask of a studio than it sounds like from the outside, but it's the only thing that ever actually brought any of this back to life in the first place, and it's the only thing that ever will.